Hey Eric, thanks for coming on the show. Welcome to the Unscripted Arena. It's good to have you here, and we met a few times here while you were in Seattle. But it sounds like you've been traveling the globe lately. Where you at right now?
I'm in London, specifically
London.
Camden Town. So,
Oh, nice. What's going on over there?
I was invited here by Parliament. A member of Parliament, a couple members, the Earl of Errol, Merlin Hay, Baroness Uden, and their offices to talk about our technology and how it can help them um, better secure their critical systems and other things. So it's been pretty fruitful.
So, how would you say you found yourself in London today? And let's go back, like, kind of your origin story.
Yeah, I mean, I guess being from California, I think you're either in tech or adjacent to tech. So I have always been a person that was my nose in front of a computer. Started coding when I was 7, 8 years old. Um, Built my own computer when I was 12 or 13, and knew this was a space that I would find myself in pretty extensively. And you know, when you're in your 20s, you're kind of like walking in the dark, looking down at your feet. So I basically bumpered my way into this opportunity. Um, I was a big history nerd as well as being a tech guy. And so I had an opportunity to write a white paper that was published by McKinsey's ESIC, Early Stage Investor Conference, that effectively wrote and compared um, human governance and human governments to digital governance and digital governance. Um, I made a
Where was
comparison.
this?
This was during COVID, so either 2020 or 2021, I believe. Um,
Mhm.
and Yeah, 2021. And when I wrote that, it it opened a lot of eyes to where we were as a country and not even as a globe and how we deal with data. Um, you can be a republic nation or a democratic nation per se, but if your data is governed very centrally, then you're going to have bottlenecks and same consequences you have if you have an over centralized government. And so that opened up the eyes to the company I'm currently at, Wishkanish. Their founders saw that and said, "You understand our ethos inherently, and I'm sure you'll be able to help us grow this product and this technology." So, 4 years later, I find myself where I find myself here.
And you have several other businesses, right? I mean, tell us about those as well.
Yeah, when I my first real tech endeavor was um, was in the restaurant hospitality space, and I got in that space because I was working at a company called Toast, and if anyone's ever been in a restaurant, you've probably seen the Toast point of sales or handhelds. Um, and I worked with a few folks, and we came up together with an idea that would allow you to essentially take a picture at a bar or restaurant of your food or with your friends, post it to your Instagram or social media story, and then be paid cash. Um,
Interesting.
so effectively, it was a mechanism for democratized advertising. Um, and we did tens of millions of impressions within a few months because it was basically like giving out free money to people,
Yeah.
while also driving a lot of advertising. And you know, COVID happened, which as unfortunate as it was for the industry, it might have been a good thing because I would have still been doing that had that not happened because we were getting a lot of success. Um, and so that was my first real envoy into tech and entrepreneurship per se. Um, and that kind of mothballed into me getting into this space. And that's led to a number of different subsidiaries and equity positions in companies that are utilizing different variations of these techs that I've worked on and productizing them in verticals that better suit their businesses. their business interests and business needs.
Where in California are you from?
I was born in Berkeley,
Mm,
so my both my parents are UC Berkeley grads.
okay.
So I was a Bay Area kid initially, but then moved down to Southern California. Um, Spent some years in Chicago as an adolescent, so I do have like that little Midwestern edge, which helps.
Yeah.
Um, and so,
Softens you out, or
right. So, um, definitely have a good balance of both worlds. But it's it's interesting being a Californian with a Chicago sensibility. It gives you a different tact when it comes to I don't know what your language policy here is, but a little bit of the
oh,
wait,
fair.
it gives you a little tact when you're dealing with a lot of fuckery, and so um, it's been it's been valuable.
Yeah. Now, were you in the military as well, or
No, I come from a family of military folks. My brother is
okay?
still actively in the U.S. Air Force. He works with the Pentagon. My uncle.
He's probably been really busy lately, huh?
Oh yeah. He sent me a picture of him and Conor McGregor, and I was like, oh, everybody's showing up there now, huh?
Yeah.
My uncle, both my uncles were U.S. Army. One runs the big military hospital out in Fort near Belvoir, I think, or Alexandria. I can't remember the name of it. Got tons of family in military, so which was kind of like was one of the big starting points for my journey with Wishkanish, because we got to two direct to face SIBRs with DoD and U.S. Air Force. One for the MQ-9 Predator drone, and one for a team assault kit, team awareness kit, tactical assault kit use case. Um, and that those two SIBRs led to our relationship with Frank Konechny, who is the former chief technical officer of the U.S. Air Force, and then once retiring there, joined us as our COO.
Oh, wow.
So uh, we really got our mark with defense, and it's been fruitful, and it's been really great to be able to like have technology that I believe not only keeps our troops secure and their system secure, but more importantly allows for us to believe that innovation isn't something that is just talked about, but actually has real accessibility and applicability.
Yeah. I overheard. I saw a YouTube episode on Eric Prince and his talk at Hillsdale College. It was interesting to see how technology, even low tech, compared to what we have as an arsenal. And he said something about we're throwing $1 million equipment at $2,000 equipment in Ukraine, right? Because they've
Yeah.
had to innovate. So a lot of innovation has come from a need on the battlefield, right?
Yep.
So you look at Wishkanish, it sounds like your technology, from what I understood, it connects a lot of systems in a more efficient way for less cost. Now, is that a fair assumption?
Um, in some ways, yes. I think the most specific and accurate description is it enables federated data governance at the edge. And what I mean by the edge is, I'm talking about IoT, right? We have so many devices now that exist with their own networks, sensors, anything you name, phones, all of it,
Mm-hmm.
walkie-talkies, they all have some type of chip involved with some type of network. And that independence of systems has value, but it also creates massive risk surface.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a meeting with MITRE about 2 years ago, the think tank out of DC, and they told me that companies like Google and Facebook, or Meta, know 10 to 1 about public safety what the government knows. And that's because they own and create and enable a lot of this IoT, right? So if we have these centralized authorities like our NIST, like our um, you know, core cyber systems, Central Intelligence Agency, DoD, you know, whatever you name it, that have the proper regulations, have the proper rules, have the proper standards, but can't enforce them at the edge,
Hmm.
or commercially incentivize them at the edge, nor do they have the ability to consume and have awareness of all that data because of their centralization, then the only response is to enable a federated model of decentralization that allows for you to um, monitor and regulate data at the edge in ways that essentially gives you not only situational awareness, but
Hmm.
can enable commercialization of that awareness for those entities at the edge to now be commercially incentivized to want to um, participate in your federated mechanism. It's not about when our this mirror this type of mechanism off of our government. It's not about the government overreaching into states, and over regulating into certain mechanisms that the states or corporations want to do, but it's about just making sure that things are safe, things are ethical, equitable, in some cases, as Hesketh said, lethal when necessary,
Right.
and um, I think that's all something that needs to be done, both centrally but also at the edge, because we're looking at a very stark future without that type of governance.
So what would be like one good example of what you mean by governance at the edge, and
Yeah.
what does equitable look like as an example?
Right. So I do a lot of work in energy and critical systems at the grid level. So when we look at our grid, we have power plants, generators, then we have these substations and transformers that then send power through HKV lines, DCKV lines down to these uh, these smaller substations that then distribute it to homes, right? And that's been the way things have done for since the beginning of transmission power. Well, more recently, we've seen the explosion of the renewable industry, which has been great in many ways, right? We have so much power demand, being able to create new power when the grid can't handle it, or the grid doesn't have the money to upgrade the transmission is valuable, right? Um, and then obviously for those that that are really concerned about the environment, um, having cleaner forms of energy is also valuable. Depending on how you interpret clean. We're not going to get down that rabbit hole, but it's still valuable. Now, where there is an issue is that all of these systems that are generating this power now at the edge have their own networks. They oftentimes aren't manufactured in the US. Many times they have counterfeit components. Many times they can be, because of those counterfeit components, because of these network gaps, are liable for a remote telemetry operation where someone from a
Mhm.
different area could effectively control those devices. There's been dozens and dozens of reports written about load oscillation or manipulation of demand via IoT that effectively is happening at the edge. And if we have bulk electric systems that are connected to the edge, then now the cybersecurity standards for bulk electric that don't extend to the edge are now completely thrown out the window because you effectively have a Trojan horse that's coming into your systems. And without getting too many details, we do have this problem actively. We have tons of compromised bulk electric systems because of what's happening at the edge. So this is what I mean in the sense that if you can enable mechanisms of governance and situational awareness at the edge that can allow those authorities to effectively isolate, segregate, and potentially even mitigate these issues when they happen or before they cascade, then that is the manifestation of our technology effectively. It's taking issues that can generate from the lack of edge control and edge awareness that have massive risk profiles and isolating them. What what we have to recognize is that in our nation, warfare is done a lot differently now. There are, as a country, if we have 2 weeks without power and no network, that's a recipe for disaster. And we have to think that if we're introducing so many other entities at our edge that are now have access to our grid, then what are we really doing?
Mhm.
And why is it that so many entities outside of our nation want to produce so many assets towards the edge? I think that's something that we have to be a little bit more introspective about and, you know, trust but verify. And it means that, we have to uh, still enable the good, but also, I'd sacrifice the the ceiling for the sake of more power.
How are governments receiving this message? Because I
Well,
mean, you work with a lot of. Sounds like you've been talking with a lot of governments.
yeah, government always wants to hear about security. They always want to make sure that they're insulating their values and insulating their systems and critical systems from foreign actors or malicious threats, etc. Um, but government is also plagued by inertia, and a lot of times when you look at energy and the utilities that operate, um, they are federally indemnified, they're federally subsidized, so they are effectively extensions of the government, and so they're plagued by inertia. So when dealing with government, what's great is for you to utilize government as a platform to evangelize the risk and
Mhm.
explain that you have solutions, and then simultaneously engage with, like what we do. We engage with insurance heavily. We engage with um, corporations that are at the edge that would be incentivized for the monetary gain from some of these postures, and then we bring them to the table collectively with government, and then now government has speed because they see that there are forcing functions that cause their inertia to dissipate,
Mhm.
particularly when you're talking about insurance. So it's really a mechanism of burning the candle from both ends.
And how does insurance play into this?
Well, my, I'll say this about insurance. I personally believe insurance um, is the insurance industry is they're the most powerful mofos on the planet,
Yep.
um, point blank. And um, when you look at the edge and you look at the total addressable market from all the microservices that can be done at the edge, either locally or in the cloud or on-prem, you're talking about $1 trillion at least. And um, none of it, frankly, is really insured. And so many insurers don't touch systemic risks. Some might challenge that statement. But if you can create commercial opportunities that corporations will sassify down to a consumer level. Um, so what I mean is like if there's a person who says, okay, I'll pay $5-10 a month to mesh my home. Now that risk profile is down to an individual level, which means an insurer can then create a wrapper around that product because it's not inherently systemic because they can always say, well, that person didn't pay or that person did this or a person did that. So that opens up the
You can
doorway
almost
for
catch the problem at the source before
right.
it balloons up.
I would look at it like imagine there's a an island and at the edge of your island, um, there's a fire and the fire is encroaching towards the middle. Um, the insurance says like, listen, the island burns down, we're not going to cover it, but we will cover this patch of dirt and we'll cover that patch of dirt. So effectively, you can scale those patches of dirt in ways that effectively insulate the island, um, and almost use that, create embankments to keep the analogy going. And that's where insurance becomes really valuable. There's something called the Price Anderson Act that came about in 1957, I believe, and it was with the nuclear industry, and it provided a system of financial protections for persons who may be liable and persons who may be injured by a nuclear accident. Um, and it was designed to partially compensate the nuclear industry against liability claims, right? While ensuring public compensation coverage. So a lot of what they did was pull risk from both private, operators, federal indemnification from the government, which then allowed the insurance company to get in. And so that was a real almost hallmark for how we wanted to operate. Because if you could take the nuclear industry and the power that could create, but the risk, I mean, it's a nuclear power plant for crying out loud, then we knew that the cyber, the insurance industry wouldn't be averse to this opportunity. They just needed the support and the TAM to be proven and a technology that could be that cornerstone. So that's where we saw there was a real opportunity.
So what other gaps in the industry that you see where Wishkanish can really provide value as it
Well,
relates to the AI blockchain, and where might that apply with um, governments, municipalities?
right. Well, I had mentioned earlier a little bit about counterfeit components, and what I had come to find about a year or so ago was that the counterfeit component industry in the U.S. Um, is 17 times bigger than the illegal drug trade. It is the biggest scam industry in the world, right?
What do you mean counterfeit?
So effectively, it could be IoT, it could be machinery, it could be hardware. It's when there's a piece or a component in there that's doing something that it's not supposed to be doing. Um, that's not supposed to be in there. And now with the revolution of 3D printing, you can have a manufacturer that has a true component in one hand and a false component in another, and they can't tell the difference. So it's taking some very sophisticated granular mechanisms to measure the variations and the anomalies that exist from those counterfeit entities. And being able to kind of nip this in the bud at the supply chain level is a massive opportunity. Because at the end of the day, when you look at distributed ledger technologies like ours or like blockchains, um, it's really just data provenance at the end of the day. So effectively, you can create a data cookie crumb trail that allows for you to recognize um, falsehoods or truth or anomalies from the right thing from the wrong thing, and that's something that is going to be really valuable as we move forward for mitigating a lot of these problems before they cascade.
Yeah, sounds like I just looked up counterfeits, and it looks like 47 in 2023, 47.9% of pharmaceuticals were seized out of the whole counterfeit. I mean, that's
Yeah.
huge. That's medicine going into
I,
people.
I mean, it's like I said, it's 17 times bigger than the drug trade.
Wow.
It's massive, and we have to be very
Nobody's really talking about this.
well. People are talking about it; they're just not being explicit because you
Yeah.
also have to look at where do most counterfeit components come from.
Mm.
And so, I'm not here to call any nations out or anything like that. That's not what my job is here. But
Yeah.
um, I
You
would,
might find yourself at one of those nations next
yeah.
week.
All right. Luckily I have folks like ICMG.
Yeah.
Uh, it would be, there are things that are happening in
Yeah.
our government that are very aware of this at a high level. Um, and we have to recognize that, we're in a new society where there's the obvious, but there's also the covert. And you can start a war in a country just through counterfeit components because you could have a society where Volvos start turning into missiles. um, there's a really good book
Pretty
that got
wild to think, right?
yeah, I mean, there's a good book that was adapted to a movie called Leave the World Behind,
Mhm.
It's produced by, I think, the Obamas, and it talked about a massive cyber attack that caused a 0-day event. And you know, if we have this many counterfeit components within a society, and then I would encourage you to look up the Rip and Replace program, which was created several years ago in the U.S. because of this issue happening in telecom. I mean, I don't know if you've heard, but you saw Cisco got caught selling $100 million counterfeit components to the DoD. And that's not just in America. They also got caught red-handed in UK. And I'm pretty sure they didn't know they were doing it. So we have to really look at, these issues. And that goes back to my core point. If
Mhm.
you have a centralized authority that is trying to take awareness of billions of endpoints, I mean, in one factory that has a supply chain, you're talking millions of IoT endpoints, from sensors to valves to cameras to weight machines, temperature, the whole shebang. And if you don't have some type of distributed approach to measuring all the potential gaps and anomalies, or no fault founds, or tampering, you are, letting uh, the wolf in the door. And I think that's something that smart people are aware of, and they're working with policy to get them more aware, and hopefully, um, and admittedly, desperately working to create solutions.
Sounds like, I mean, the energy requirements for that is going to be massive, right? Because if you're going to tag every single thing that goes in and out of a country and then have a system to track that, it just sounds massive.
Well, yes and no. When we look at, our company, our technology is distributed ledger technology. The
Hmm.
way I try to create analogies, I said I tell them, look at a car, right? I look at vehicles in general, all types of vehicles, from planes down to commercial vehicles. If I was moving my apartment, and I put these huge U-Haul boxes in the back of a Ferrari, um, that wouldn't be the most efficient mechanism to move. But if I put it in a U-Haul truck, that's far more efficient. So when we look at the way distributed ledgers work, some are designed with mechanisms for consensus that are derived from competition and work. And that inherently is energy consumptive. That's what blockchain is, right? That's what a lot of proof of stake chains are. But if you have a ledger that works off of a rule based system, then there is no workload that goes into consensus. If there's a terminology called Byzantine fault tolerance, or a Byzantine mechanism, and I'll make it really simple. Imagine there was a person in this podcast named John, and he liked pizza, and you liked chicken, and I liked sushi, and you and John had a relationship, and me and you have a relationship, and me and John don't have a relationship. And if John and you agree that you guys are going to eat pizza,
Hmm.
and you tell me we're going to eat pizza, then I am now consistent with John, even though we don't necessarily have an implicit trust. That was based off of rules and agreements and trust, rather than um, a mechanism of competition. Well, that's a pretty bastardized example of explaining what we do. But ultimately, by creating that type of enforcement policies, you can enable federated institutions. So if we're talking about the grid, and I'm saying I'm taking the state of Texas, we could take someone like ERCOT, the Energy Board,
Hmm.
to be a federated anchor institution, and then create rules for validator institutions like the utilities. So if we're talking Houston, that could be Centerpoint. And then Centerpoint can go to their meter partners or their battery partners, like the Schneiders and the Siemens of the world, and say, hey, these are the rules for how we're going to be managing this telemetry and this data and this risk, and this energy. And you'll be commercially incentivized to follow these rules. And you'll be able to take these rules and create more commercial microservices around it. Then now you've effectively created a node network that allows for cooperation without work or competition, um, that is essentially federated. When you have a mechanism that's built off of work, not only is it extremely energy consumptive, as you've described, but the competition is derived based upon who has the most compute power, who has the most storage um, space, which now makes it completely unfair. Effectively, you can have a group of nodes that can control the whole chain. And if you're trying to throw a blockchain into a critical system, who wants some node in Kazakhstan run by a Russian oligarch controlling your critical systems? It's not going to ever happen. It's fair for speculative stuff like crypto, but it will never work for sensitive metadata and sensitive data in critical systems. Never. And this is where there's a gap between blockchain and distributed ledgers like ours, which is called a DAG, which means directed acyclic graph, which is technically speaking, a nonlinear asynchronous node environment, effectively like a matrix. And if there's folks listening and they want to see what that means, just type in blockchain versus DAG, that's DAG, and you'll see the difference. And effectively, that explains why one thing requires a lot of work and energy and why ours doesn't. We can run on something as light as a Raspberry Pi.
Mm-hmm.
So the scalability is really just a mechanism of how much do you want and what do you want to do.
Interesting. So, I mean, it sounds like this technology can help with, the Doge movement going on right now.
Yeah.
I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I had a meeting with the Department of Treasury about 3 weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
and money moving in various mechanisms is a huge issue, and being able to track and trace and detect anomalies based upon certain activities with capital is definitely something we can do, which I think would bring a tremendous amount of value to the Doge folks. Because all government has problems with spending and keeping account of certain things, and being able to effectively track and trace the efficacy of certain dollars, and or just the use or the evaporation of money per se, then I think that would be a mechanism that can allow Doge to consistently have a means to audit all these things. What I like to tell people that don't really understand the technical part of what we do is that basically we're a glorified auditing system for IoT. So, data now is implicit to money. And if you can effectively use that as a mechanism to track and trace where money is going, and being spent and being used, then now you do have a very strong tool.
Now you're in the thick of this whole, technology. It's almost like farmers getting introduced to tractors, right? I feel like that's where we're at. I mean, because you're in the thick of it and you're seeing these, incremental updates to improving the systems that we have. In terms of humanity, where do you see where we are today, and what are you seeing down the road?
Well, every 2 seconds you hear AI somewhere, right?
Yep.
And the way that humans view food, water, and money is the way AI views data and energy. So if we can create mechanisms that allow us to commercialize and bottleneck data and energy, then as humans, we will have the reins for the future of AI scale, no matter how many GPUs or how smart or how strong it gets. At the end of the day, we'll always need power. At the end of the day, it will always need some type of mechanism for consuming data. So one of the reasons why we've focused so heavily on energy security, and so focused so heavily on data governance, is that we know that we can create a means for our society and humans to effectively create capital in a world where their economic output is going to be minimized based upon what these smart systems and AI functions can do. And I don't think it's a scary future, frankly. I think it's something that is just inevitable.
You're pretty optimistic then.
Well, I as an
Or do
as
you
an
think
engineer,
there's going to be some pain before optimism?
I mean, there's always pain. I mean, I always tell people, like, when cars were first created, we didn't have roads, and so there were a lot of accidents and a lot of deaths. Um, but if you're thinking in 10 years, you're thinking in 20 years, you're thinking in 30 years, then you can see where those roads need to be built, so we can um, eliminate the ceiling of risk. Um, I think there's a tangible future ahead, um, and it's important, right? I said in the beginning, from MITRE, there's this gap between what the government knows about public safety, what the government knows about IoT in general, and as a government that's elected by the people, they have a responsibility to us, and so if we can create means for them to bottleneck the energy and bottleneck the data, then effectively we've created a means for government to um, insulate our future,
Hmm.
at least in my opinion.
It'd be interesting to see what happens because I had a conversation with an attorney and I asked him what happens to your industry once people, you know, can upload a document or create your own, estate plan or buy sell agreement or some sort of business document. What happens to their industry? And the guy pretty much said that his whole department could be out of business. And when you look at, and then it begs the question, right? If your whole life was dependent on that industry, what's your new identity? And then where do you create income? And then how is the government going to create income for you? And I think that's what people are scared about is what am I going to do?
I mean,
Because this will wipe out industries real fast.
yeah, I mean that's a fact. I mean, we have companies are fiduciarily responsible to their shareholders, and if an entity sees that automating their manufacturing or automating their front office or whatever the case may be creates more EBITDA for their commercial strategy, they're going to do it. They're obligated to do it for those shareholders. So, there are some things where you can see companies that let go people. Maybe they give those people some shares, right? Who knows?
Yeah.
That's altruistic. But I think when you have a world that can effectively take over work, and as I said, their money and food is energy and water. I think if people and governments start to take advantage of that, we could create a mechanism of UBI that's derivative of how much your community can produce and control energy, and how much your community is able to govern data, both from local production and also from the more macro production. I think that's something that gets kind of into more advanced topics, but I will say that if we stay really focused on the construct that data and energy are still finite resources, then one can recognize that those things can be controlled and scalably commercialized in ways that can benefit people if the entities that are commercializing it have people in mind. So that's something where government will have to begin to work cooperatively with those entities. But I don't think it's impossible. And I don't think it's stark. I just think the challenge is great, but the momentum is definitely there.
And you're finding that the people you're meeting with are thinking about this and thinking about people in general and how that will affect their people.
Yeah, 100%. I
Yeah.
mean, I have family that thinks I'll be speaking Mandarin if they were listening to this conversation. So
Yeah.
I'm not I'm not here to create this super techie world, right? There's there are ways that we can create services and jobs and new jobs around this industry that will have sustainability and efficacy for the years to come. And if we do see a world where we can create robotics that can operate just like humans, if not more efficiently, then that's when I will challenge us to think that what's the next step for us. It's really difficult to think about things like simulation theory and the ideology that you might see someone that actually already is that's not a human but it's something else. But who knows. I think it's just up to us to really begin to start with the low hanging fruit, and take control of what we can and just continue to iterate from there.
So I think that's a good segue to, why don't you share with us some of your kind of defining moments? Uh, I say top three defining moments as on this journey that you're on.
um, well, one, speaking at Parliament twice had to have been I bet been a big one. I had a great conversation with some federal buyers in DC who, when hearing this in our technology, were like, "This is it." They got it immediately. That was very reassuring. And I would really just say the process has been a defining moment. Just seeing where we started to where we're at, um, and that little war of attrition. It's like that that analogy: get 1% better every day. Um, it's real and it's manifesting in real time. And so that those three things, um, you know, the latter being the most, the last thing I said being the most valuable, um, I think is what really defines what we are, who we are in our process.
What would you say is your most proudest win so far?
Um, well, I don't think I can say publicly right now, but I will say that we are involved with a very, very, very large project, um, that's going to be dealing with gigawatts of power, um, and a massive opportunity for couple states in our country. Um, so I'm pretty excited about that. And I would say that there's a lot of conversations happening across the country in the world with other entities. But because I'm under NDA for a lot of these things, I just have to keep them pretty close to chest. But there are some big stuff happening.
Now, how about fears? What would you say your three fears are as you have these conversations?
Um, well, I would say there are some nations out there that um, aren't interested in um, us mitigating some of their efforts at the edge. And I want to call it a fear. I would just say it's a concern. Um, I would also say that inertia is another concern. Um, as a nation, we have to put innovation at the forefront. The reason why we dominated space, the reason why we got to the moon first, the reason why we have the most advanced military in the world is because of innovation and putting innovators on a pedestal. And yeah, innovators at times have high customer acquisition costs and the EBITDA doesn't always look good, but it's necessary for us to stay first.
Mm-hmm.
And we really need to invest in STEM. We need some of these people coming out of our schools and out of our universities. Not saying that we can't be a mechanism to support people from all over the globe to create these technologies. I think that's a part of the benefit of being America. But I think that we definitely need to invest into our communities so we can have these engineers popping up. So when we're looking at the future, we're looking at future jobs and we're looking at where the jobs exist, we can have a society that is poised to tackle these challenges.
Interesting. And I think you're right. I mean, I overheard a large bank CFO say that, and this was last year, towards the end of last year, and he talked about how one of the competitive advantages of our nation is that it's ingrained in our nation to be an innovator, and somehow we need to get back to tapping that and just go full force on that mentality. Because I mean, we've somewhat lost that path in some regards, but for the most part, that's something that, as a nation, is a competitive advantage. So it's
Yeah,
interesting that you bring that up, right?
yeah,
Um,
definitely.
as we wrap up here, what advice would you have for aspiring entrepreneurs? And conversely, what advice do you have for other business leaders as you have these conversations?
For entrepreneurs, especially the ones that are in their early stages, one, don't quit, um, and try to surround yourself with people that are smarter than you, and that know are good at things that you're not good at, um, and make sure you're in a pathway where you're always learning every single day, learning something new, developing deeper the knowledge of what you already do know. Um, that's that's imperative. Um, and for business leaders, um, we hear all these buzzwords about AI this or agentic this or it's X, Y, and Z. And a lot of times they just throw money at something, hoping something sticks. I would encourage more business leaders to actually look for subject matter experts in that space before they pursue those investments. We all look at the big SoftBank issue and all these companies coming out from Y Combinator and other spaces that have these overinflated values for products that don't exist. And, they're getting real money for fake stuff, which is effectively devaluing the dollar. Um, we need to, one, prioritize being lean more as a country. And as a business minded people, just focus on being lean more and actually taking on capital and speed, not when you're figuring stuff out, but when you actually need speed. Um, Throwing speed at situations when you're figuring stuff out is a recipe for disaster. You're gaslighting yourself effectively. Um, I
Right.
think I think that's something that we need to do a better job of, especially in the tech space.
Yeah, I agree. So I guess in closing, man, what are you looking forward to the remainder of the year?
Um, well, we have a global footprint. I want to continue to grow that. I would love to get involved, have apparatuses both in the global north and the global south. Um, and I would like to see publicly from a legislative body someone attesting to the value of the edge and governance at the edge. I think that would be something that would open up the floodgates for us, and I that would be a huge win.
Awesome. Well, hey Eric, it was great having you on the show. Thanks for coming on, and safe travels on the next continent you might find yourself in.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Tony, for your time. I appreciate it.